We'll have a little bit of rain, a little moisture. Feels good, smells good. Wonderful day. You know, scales are very important in the Bible. Something we see throughout the scriptures is the idea of scales. Scales in Bible times and Old Testament times and even in New Testament times were used to buy, to sell, to barter, and they were could be tampered with. They could be fraudulent scales. They could be used for purposes that weren't how you want it to be used. They were often used in the Bible to talk about famine, to talk about the horse of the apocalypse. One of them, fourth horse of the apocalypse, had a scale in his hand, talking about famine, talking about that idea. So scales in the ancient world were something that was easily used, something you saw every day. We don't see that much today. Matter of fact, we see it very seldom. If you watch some of the old Western movies, when they go to weigh their gold, they'll put it on the scale, won't they? Put it on the scale to see how it measures out. But scales in the ancient world were very visible. They were used, and they were a great illustration for things to do with God. In Micah 6, it says, "Can I justify wicked scales in a bag of deceptive weights?" So there were ways that they could use scales to deceive you, couldn't they? The weights maybe would not be an accurate weight. So when you would go to trade, they would short you because they would put a lesser weight on the scale than what you desired. Or they could work the mechanics of the scale and where the balance point was to make it deceptive. So scales could be deceptive, and often in the Bible we talk about that. And God in Leviticus, he was very much put forth to them that I want you to use a fair scale. I want you to be fair people, righteous people, upright people. And in Leviticus, he says, you shall have just balances, God says, and just weights. In other words, I expect you to give, to sell, to barter, to do it in a right way. And God charged them with that. And a just hand, I am the Lord your God who brought you out from the land of Egypt. In ancient times, although a shekel in New Testament times was money, it was a coin or a unit of money, the shekel was originally a weight. It wasn't a coin, it was a weight that was used on a scale. So that's how that transferred into money, into coinage, into what things are worth, and even in our society. So you wanted scales to be true. You wanted them to be balanced. We often see scales with what we call Lady Justice, right? Justia, the Greek goddess of justice that was relatively a new goddess. Actually, it was Augustus Caesar who made her a goddess. But we don't really recognize her as a goddess today, but we do see this in our legal system. And we understand that idea. She's always seen generally blindfolded so that she can't be influenced, with a set of scales in her hand and a sword by her side. And that's what we kind of use to illustrate justice in our system. The idea that justice should be fair, should be equitable. The scales should be honest, should be blind, that the scales should judge. And so we use that in our legal system. But even in ancient Egypt, even in other cultures, scales were something that was used. In ancient Egypt, in the Book of the Dead, which was used up till about 50 BC in Egypt, there's a depiction here of a scales. And on one side, of course, it's hard for us to see that, but on one side is a human heart, and on the other side is the feather of truth. And in this Book of the Dead, you're being balanced between our heart and between truth. So the idea of what we carry in this life is not sometimes unique just to Christianity. A lot of faiths of the world believe what we do here is important, that there's a balance to life, that there's a balance to what we do in this world, there's a balance to death, that things matter here. And I think that's really the point that I want to try to bring home to you today, is that things matter. What we do in this life matters in the next. The Bible tells us to lay up for ourselves treasures in heaven, where moth nor rust doth corrupt, nor thieves break in and steal. Right? It says, don't lay up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust corrupt, and thieves break in and steal. Jesus is telling us that there's a balance to life. He expects us to live our life, and He expects us to enjoy our life. I believe that. He put things in place for us to enjoy. He gave us a world that was built to fit our needs and to suit our purpose. And God does expect us to enjoy this life. He made certain that we could do that, didn't He? But He also expects us to prepare for the next life. And I think in that there's a balance, isn't there? How much do I spend on me? What do I spend on God? What do I spend on my family? How does that all work out in the scope and the face of eternity with God? I think those are questions we should think about a little bit. Because God holds the scales. That's something we see throughout Scripture. God holds the scales in His hand. You know, Hannah, in the birth of Samuel, in 1 Samuel, in Hannah's praise to God, Hannah, in her praise to God, in 1 Samuel chapter 2, verse 3, she says, "Boast no more so very proudly. Don't let arrogance come out of your mouth." For what does she say? "For the Lord is a God of knowledge, and with Him actions are weighed." You know, Hannah understood that there was a balance to life, a give and take to life. And who would understand that better than Hannah? Do you remember the story of Hannah? How she was barren, and He loved her more than all the others, and she desired a child. Remember that story? And so she goes to the temple with him, and Eli is the priest, and she's praying to herself, and her lips are moving, but nothing's coming out. And Eli thinks she's drunk, and Eli kind of reprimands her, and she says, "No, I'm praying to God the prayers of my heart." And she vowed to the Lord. She said, "If you'll allow me to have a son, I will vow him to you. I will give him to the Lord." Right? You know, there's people here with just now with a young baby and a young baby over here and young children. And can you imagine as a mother making that plea to God and following through with it as Hannah did when she weaned Samuel? She took him to the temple and she left him. She left him there and she went home. She left him at the temple because she had vowed him to God. And when she did that and when she left him there, she makes this prayer and she says, "With you actions are weighed." Actions are weighed. In other words, I made a vow to you. And you gave me what I desired, and I'm fulfilling my vow. There's a balance to this. A balance that Hannah saw, and she says, "You hold the scales, Lord, and with you actions are weighed." And as she left her child at the temple to only come back and see him once a year, she left her child at the temple. Don't you know, on Hannah's heart, she thought, "Lord, with you my actions are weighed." There was a balance. You did what you said you would do. I said what I said I would do. With you my actions are weighed. How hard would that have been for a mother with no children, her only child, that she had prayed to God? How hard would that have been the day she left him at the temple with Eli and went back to her house only to see him once a year? Can you imagine? Sometimes we forget that, don't we, in that story? Hannah, the feeling she had as a mother, leaving her child. And in that passionate discourse, she says, "With you, Lord, my actions are weighed." You know, you and I, we do things with our life. And do we consider that our actions are being weighed by God? What we do, what we intend to do for the Lord, what we covenant with Him to do. That those things have weight, have power. It was the ancient texts of Job, where Job was criticized and by his friends who came and said, "What did you do? Just tell us what you did, that God would punish you in such a way that He's punished you." And it's Job who in the 31st chapter, he says, "If I have walked with falsehood and my foot has hastened after deceit, let him weigh me with accurate scales, and let God know my integrity." Let Him weigh me with accurate scales. Job understood that what man says about us, what man can accuse us of, doesn't matter. What matters is our integrity with God. Let Him weigh me with accurate scales. Isn't that what we want? We want justice, don't we? We want justice from God in our lives. We want our lives to be weighed. And how do we measure up? How does our life fit in the balance of God? You know, so many times with God and us, in our misery, in our grief, in our poverty, in our displeasure, and the things that hurt us, we reach out and cry out to God, don't we? We want Him to hear our prayer and to lift us from the burden that's upon us, don't we? But brethren, how many times in our prosperity do we look towards the Lord? And do we think, Lord, in my prosperity, who would you have me to be? Who would you have me to be? That's a really good question that we should often ask ourselves. If we're really thankful for something, we should say, how can I use that for God's glory, for what God would have me to do? You know, there's really nothing in this life that we'll take with us except what we give away, and we often forget that, don't we, as people? But God doesn't forget. God knows. God knows your heart. He knows your intent. He knows whether you serve Him in your poverty or your prosperity. You know, it's interesting. We look at the widow's mite, and what a powerful story, and he used that in a sermon, and I just love that story about the widow's mite, and they're putting in, and God said she gave all she had. But you know, the truth is, in Jesus' death, it was a rich man, wasn't it? Joseph of Arimathea, who came to Pilate and said, I want the body of Jesus to bury him in my tomb where no man has ever been laid. It was a rich man who thought about Christ, wasn't it? And isn't there a lesson in that? That even in prosperity, we think about Jesus and about what He means for us. Job said, weigh me with accurate scales. I'd kind of like it to tip a little bit in my favor. How about you when God weighed me? But the truth is, God's going to be accurate in His way, in His judgment of who we are. In 2 Corinthians 5:10, listen to what Paul says. He says, we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, so that each one may be recompensed for his deeds in the body, according to what he has done, whether good or bad. You know, as Christians, somehow we think we get a get-out-of-jail-free card, don't we, when it comes to judgment. That you and I will never have to stand before God, stand before Him and answer, stand before Him, and how difficult is that going to be? People often say, well, what does it mean, Rex? I mean, Jesus died for my sins. He died for my past. And He died for my sins that I committed. So what does that mean? What will I be answering for? What will I stand before God? What will He judge me for? Well, have you ever thought He's going to judge you for what we did in this life? That what we do in this life, what we do here, matters up there. I've often thought how scary it would be to go to heaven and to meet God and for His judgment of Rex to show me a video of all the things I could have done for Him that I never did. How would that be? You know, just to be judged for what we do wrong, for our sin. We understand our sin's covered. We understand that Jesus died for that. But don't we also understand that what we do is important? You know, if we read the book of Malachi, Malachi says that there's two books, doesn't he? He says there's a book of life. We understand that. But he also said, and I love how Red Coleman always used to say this, or probably still does say it, I guess. Red Coleman always says there's a book of memories. And that's really what Malachi says. He says, don't you know for my righteous people that all those things you do, that I've written them down? And so when we get to that judgment, don't you understand that there's more there than just a name that says you're going to heaven or you're not? Well, that's very important. I mean, I agree with you. Of all things, that's the most important thing. But don't we understand there's another book? We're going to look at that. There's something else there that matters. You know, my sister, I miss dearly, but my sister was a truck driver. Those of you that knew my sister, she was a truck driver, and she later in life, and of course I've been a mechanic my whole life, and she used to park her truck at my shop, and one day she didn't leave. She came in, she didn't go, and I said, "Why aren't you going? Why aren't you hauling today? Why aren't you driving today?" And she says, "Well, I've got a meeting, a Bible class meeting to learn how to be a better Bible school teacher." And I said, and I knew they was kind of struggling. I said, "Don't you really need to work today?" And my sister looked at me and she said, "It's more important that I lay up my treasures in heaven." And it wasn't too long after that we lost her. She died. And I thought, was it important for her to take that load, or was it important for her to go spend some time with God? The truth is there's a balance to life, isn't there? To our spirituality, to our faith. There's a balance. And so many times we tip the balance in our direction and not in God's direction. And I think you and I, as Christians and as people in this country that have the prosperity that we have, don't you think God demands from us more than maybe he would somebody that was living in a country that was just struggling to eat, struggling to survive? You and I don't think many of us in here struggle to eat, do we? I think we're pretty well taken care of. Don't you think God maybe would desire from us a little bit more than he would from them? What a blessing he's given us to be here, to live here, hasn't he? It's a blessing, isn't it? We could just have easily been born to some third world country, some place where our very survival would be challenged. And yet God allowed us, blessed us to live here, to be here. Don't you think we should repay that? Don't you think it should be a burden on us to repay what God's given us? I do. We must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ so that we can be recompensed for our deeds. We don't like to think there's places in heaven or levels of heaven, but the Bible kind of attests that there is, that more will be given to those who have done more and less to others. Now, I understand heaven's heaven, and I've often heard that argument, if I could just have a tent on the wall of heaven, I'd be happy. I would too, right? Or a little, how's the old bluegrass song go? Had a shack in the corner of heaven. Shack in the corner of Glory Land or something. Can't remember that song. I'd be happy, right? But the truth is, wouldn't it be nice when you got to meet the Lord that he would be able to say, "Well done, that you've done what I wanted you to do." I do. I think as Christians we should strive to do that. In Revelation, the great white throne judgment. I saw a great white throne, and him who sat upon it, whose presence earth and heaven fled away, and no place is found for them. And I saw the dead, the great and the small, standing before the throne. And listen to what it says. The books were opened. Not the book, not just a book. The books were opened. One day you and I are going to stand before God, and the books are going to be opened, aren't they? The books. And it says, and another book was opened, which is the book of life. You see that? There's more than one book. What you're doing, you're writing your story. You're writing your story right now. You're writing it with your life. There's a page for you, page in heaven. And God's writing what you do right now. You ever thought about that? That's pretty powerful, isn't it? I hope God can make an entry every day of your life for something you do for him, don't you? I hope when I get to heaven and he opens to my page, I hope it's pages, not just page. And I hope there's something on the page, even if it's just a page. I hope there's something there, right? I hope it's not just my name at the top, like that test you don't know how to do and you just write your name and hand it in. I hope that there's actually something on my page. It says, and what does it say? It says, and the dead were judged from the things which are written in the books according to their deeds. Sounds a lot like Paul in Corinthians, doesn't it? And the sea gave up the dead, and death and Hades gave up the dead, and they were judged, every one. And death and Hades were thrown in the lake of fire. This is the second death. If anyone's name was not found written in the book of life, he was thrown into the lake of fire. You see, heaven is our promise. It's God said, I'm going to give you that. If you're a Christian, I'm going to give you heaven, right? I'm going to give you heaven. If you come to me at the last minute, the last hour of your day, the last hour of your life, and you're repenting and you truly believe that I'm the Son of God, heaven is yours. Heaven is yours. But there's not going to be much written in your book, is there? You know, so many times people say, well, I'm going to be a Christian in a few years when I get my life straightened out. I'm just not ready yet. You know, you need to be writing in your book. You need to be filling your book now. You need to be doing those things that God would have you to do. In 1 Corinthians 3, this is the smell like smoke passage of the Bible. That's what I call this, the smell like smoke passage of the Bible. And Paul really lays it out here for us. He says, according to the grace of God, like a wise master builder, I laid a foundation, and another is building on it. But each man must be careful how he builds. For no man can lay a foundation other than the one which is laid, which is Jesus Christ. And if any man builds on the foundation with gold, silver, precious stones, wood, hay, straw, each man's work will become evident. For the day will show it, because it is to be revealed with fire, and the fire itself will test the quality of each man's work. So what do we do? What are we storing up? What does God expect us to do? You know, often I question myself about this. I say, what do I do for God? Really for God. Not for me, right? Because a lot of things I do, it's for me. I'm just being honest, right? I'm just being honest. And I really believe that I'm a fairly good person. I mean, I do. I'm not just saying that to pump myself. I'm just making an illustration. I think I'm a fairly good person. I'm not the best person, but I think I'm all right. Maybe 55%, right? So the truth is that I think even without God in my life, I think I'd be a decent guy. You know, I mean, I do. I mean, I just think I would be. And so I had to think, so what has God brought to my life? What am I doing for God that I wouldn't do if it was just Rex, right? And doesn't Jesus talk about this a little bit in the Sermon on the Mount? He says, if you just do good to those who do good to you, what reward have you? Isn't that what he says? He says even the tax collectors, even the Gentiles, even the pagans do that. Everybody does that. Everybody will do good to those who do good to you, right? He says, what reward is there in that? So when we live as a Christian, sometimes, and this is maybe just Rex, maybe you don't ever have this thought. Maybe this is just me. But in my mind, I have to think, what am I doing because of God? And what am I doing just because I'm Rex? You know, at what point am I doing something that it's just because of God? It's just a God thing, not a Rex thing, but a God thing. But then Jesus goes on to say, he says, but if you love your enemies, if you pray for those who use you, if you do good to those who abuse you, great is your reward in heaven. Right? What's written on that page in heaven is not going to be everything that you do just because you're you, just because you're a good person. I believe that. I think most everybody in here is a pretty good person. I don't think we have any axe murderers here, serial killers, you know, thieves, robbers. I don't think we have any of those people in here. I just don't think we do. So just to be you, you know, Jesus, what did he say to the slave that was serving him? He says, do you expect me to reward you for doing just what you're supposed to do? I'm going to reward you when you do more than you're supposed to do. So when you go through your day and your life and you're thinking, how am I balancing out? Right? How am I balancing out here? At the end of your day, I do, and I don't always get the answer I want, let me tell you. But at the end of my day, I think, what did I do today for God that I wouldn't have done without him? What made this day a God day? Did I help somebody today that without God I wouldn't have done it? Was I kind to somebody today that without Jesus I wouldn't have been kind to? Was I helpful to somebody today that didn't appreciate it or maybe didn't deserve it? Or was I just being Rex? The truth of it is that faith has to move you to a place that you're not without it. That's what faith has to do. Faith has to tell you to do, make you do things that without it you wouldn't do. Look at Hebrews 11, the great chapter of faith in the Bible. It says, by faith Abraham left to a land, not knowing where he was going. By faith Noah built an ark to the saving of his household. By faith Rahab hid the spies. By faith Abraham offered Isaac on the altar. Right? By faith Moses led the people out of Egypt. He says all these did this by faith, not receiving the promise, never receiving the promise. They did what God wanted them to do, and they didn't ask why. They just did it. You and I, when we do what God wants us to do, and we don't ask why, and we just do it, and we don't expect reward, and we just do it, then we're tipping the scales in our favor. And it's little victories in our life that do it. Little victories. Being God people instead of being people that change how it all works. If you look at this passage, it says, if any man's work which he has built remains, he'll receive a reward. You see that? So what you do here, it matters. I don't really understand it. I can't really tell you what the reward is. I just don't know. I don't know. But I know it exists. Because the inspired Paul said that it exists. Jesus says that it exists. But then listen to what he says. He says, if any man's work is burned up, he will suffer loss, but he himself will be saved. You see, heaven you can't lose because heaven's your gift. You can't earn it. What we do here doesn't get us heaven, but it gets us something. But then listen to what he says. Yet so is through the fire. So if your work all gets burned up, you're going to get to heaven, but you're going to smell like smoke. You see, it's the smell like smoke passage of the Bible. You're going to get to heaven, but you're going to smell like smoke. You see, I'd like to get to heaven and not smell like smoke, wouldn't you? I'd like for there to be something on my foundation of Jesus that survives the fire and the test that God's going to put it through. I'd like to think there's things in my life, pieces of my life, a balance of my life. And in that balance of my life, I would like to think that there's stuff on there that's just God stuff. That's not Rex stuff. It's just God stuff. And that God's going to, and when I go through that fire, it's still going to be there. It's still going to be there. Don't you? You know, brethren, you and I are called to be different people with Christ than we are without him. Molded and made into his image. We're called to be more than just humans, more than just people, more than just humanity, more than just animalistic. We're called to be Christian. We're called to be Christ-like. We're called to be in the image of God. And when that happens in our life, we're going to do things because of Christ that we wouldn't do without Christ in our lives. And if we can't somehow write that down, even for us, that says, these are things I did because of Jesus, then we need to reevaluate how we're living our lives. We do. We need to reevaluate it because the balance is tipped not in our favor. Do you understand? Jesus has to move us, motivate us to be more than we could be. Belshazzar, what a story. Belshazzar, the Babylonian king, who takes the vessels of the Lord they brought out of the temple when Babylonian captured the temple, he takes the vessels of the Lord and they drink wine out of them. And while they're having this feast and this party, the hand comes out and the finger writes on the wall, right? And the finger writes on the wall and it says, you know what, Belshazzar? The balances are not tipped in your favor. You have exalted yourself against the Lord of heaven, brought the vessels of his house before you, and you and your nobles, your wives and your concubines have been drinking wine from them. And you have praised the gods of silver and gold, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which do not see, hear, or understand. But the God in whose hand are your life, breath, and all your ways, you have not glorified. You say, well, Rex, we don't do that. Sure we do. Sure we do. Don't kid yourself. We all got gods of wood and stone and iron and silver in our lives, every one of us. We drive it, we live in it, we wear it on our hands. Don't you think we do? I do. How do I say they're our gods? Because we serve them. I do, don't you? I serve them. But there's got to be a balance, doesn't there, to life? So as much as we have to serve those things that we live in and we drive and we think are important to us, so also we need to be serving God. He says, Belshazzar, he says, you failed to glorify God, who gives your life and your breath and everything around you. You failed to do it. You know, I can't read this passage and I just keep hearing that old Johnny Cash song, you know, about this. Nevertheless, you can YouTube that. But he said, and then the hand was sent from him and the inscription was written out. Mean, tickle, hipshire. And this is the interpretation. God has numbered your kingdom and put an end to it. And sure enough, Darius the Mede was at the door. And the next day, Darius the Mede would rule the Babylonian Empire. God, you have been weighed on the scales and found deficient. Your kingdom has been divided and given over to the Medes and the Persians. Brethren, one day, your life will be weighed by a scales held in the hand of God Almighty. Your life will be in the balance. And I hope on that day that God doesn't say to me, your life has been weighed in the balance and found wanting. You didn't do what you should have did. You weren't the person that you should have been in my kingdom. You honored me with your lips, but your heart was far from me. You saw, but you looked, but you didn't see. You listened, but you didn't hear. Heaven is yours, but there's nothing on your page. Everything's burned up. You can go to heaven, but you weren't the person here on earth that I wanted you to be. Brother, make no mistake about it. You're writing your story with your life right now, every day when you wake up, every night when you go to bed. You're writing a ledger in heaven that one day you'll have to look at. And I hope on that day I'm not found wanting. I hope on that day I'm the person that God wanted me to be. Because one day we'll all be weighed in the balance. If there's any way we can help you today, won't you let it be known while we stand and sing.